Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. This episode is about what I consider to be the holy grail, perhaps not the holy grail, but pretty close, in the context of change work, and that is the topic of personal responsibility. Now, we agents of change, psychotherapists, coaches, we talk a lot about responsibility, taking responsibility. But what does that really mean? What does it really mean to take responsibility for something? Now, let me offer you some stuff that I've found very useful in my own change work career. And the first thing is that a person can only take responsibility for something, like screw legalities for the moment, right? I'm talking about at the psychological level. A person can only take responsibility for something if he knows that it's something he can take responsibility for. And this varies tremendously from person to person. So some very useful questions to ask is, what is this client willing and able to take responsibility for? So when you listen to someone speak and you interact with them and you watch their behaviors, what does this person take responsibility for? And just as importantly, what do they not take responsibility for? So that's one question. Another question is, what does the person not take responsibility for and know that they're not taking responsibility for? A third question is, and a very interesting one to kind of ask yourself, is what does the person not take responsibility for and not know that they're not taking responsibility for? You see, that points you towards the edge of someone's map, the edge of someone's meaning-making system, so to speak. And I highly recommend looking into adult developmental psychology for a better understanding of that topic, because if we use terms like subject and object, so when I use the term subject here, I mean that which experiences something. When I use the word object, I mean that which is experienced. Now, the ideas that we are subject to look like who we are, like we're blind to them. They just look like reality. They just look like us, right? It's only the ideas that we can take as objects that we can really take responsibility for, that we can be responsible in relationship to, because we can have a relationship to them. We can see them, we can contextualize them, we can nuance them. The ideas that have us, that we kind of view the world through, we're unable to take responsibility for those because we view the world through them. They have us. We don't have them. So let me give you a couple of practical examples here, and let me start with kids. So I remember driving my daughter one winter morning with a couple of her friends in the back seat to school, and there was a lot of snow and kind of chaotic, and during that morning, I as I was about to, let the kids get off, I had the idea that there were no cars behind me. So I put my car in reverse and I crashed into another car, right? And the kids in the back seat were screaming like, ah! And my daughter said, "Dad, whose fault was that? Who's going to have to pay for that?" And I said to her, "Me. It was my fault. I'm going to have to pay for it." So, in the legal sense, And in the psychological sense too, that one's pretty clear cut because the other car was standing still. I made a lapse in judgment. I did something, and I have to kind of take the consequences for it. But I see very clearly in raising my own kids that this topic of like what are they responsible for is something that you have to reevaluate and re-look at constantly. So I had this thing with my daughter where I would like, get her to hang up her jacket and stuff like that. And I would say, you're responsible for hanging up your jacket after school, and you're responsible for this and that. And she looked at me and she said, Dad, what am I responsible for really? And I had to think about that. And I looked at her and I said, you're responsible for what you do. Like, you are responsible for your behaviors. That's what you're responsible for. And I thought that was an appropriate level of responsibility for a child. She's 8 now. She was probably 6 or 7 at the time. Now, she likes to test me, there is something about the old saying that if you think you're enlightened, go on family vacation. So your kids can be your greatest teachers in this sense. So not long thereafter, she brought a friend home from school who sometimes has a tendency to imitate what my daughter does. So my daughter, as I'm eating and kind of tired from seeing clients, she comes over to me and she pretends to bite my shoulder. And I kind of pretend to like, that hurts, and I kind of go along and we goof off. Now, the friend doesn't realize that my daughter is joking, so she walks up to the other shoulder and starts to take an actual chunk, an actual bite out of the shoulder. And I kind of go, what the fuck? And I push her away and I give her a hard time. And I said, look, you're not a cannibal, that's food, that's dinner, this human being, no food, no eat. And I got kind of angry, and I gave her a lecture. And I look over at my daughter, and she's laughing. She's laughing herself silly, and she has this kind of wry smile. I look at her a bit sternly, and she said, Dad, I didn't do anything. I'm not responsible. And at that moment, I realized, okay, I have to renegotiate this whole responsibility thing. I have to introduce not only behaviors, but intentions. And the intentions you kind of set and what you orchestrate, that you have some responsibility within that as well. Now, so for example, and this is just an analogy. Don't take this too seriously. It's just one way of looking at things. But as a simple analogy of your capacity to take stuff as object, to have perspective, imagine a glass elevator that's at ground zero, right? You're at ground zero. Now, the person who operates here is what they in philosophy would call a naive realist, meaning this person thinks that they're just reacting to the world. They're just objectively perceiving the world and people and situations as they are, and they're reacting to it, and their emotions are triggered by events, right? There's no awareness that they're kind of co-constructing it all, internally. So if I operate there, the only thing I can really take responsibility for psychologically is how I behave. I can avoid situations, or I can attempt to figure out what other people expect and then attempt to kind of live up to that, conform, or I can try to control the world or control the situations with my behaviors, or I can learn different behaviors to kind of get what I want. But the point being that If I'm a naive realist and that's how things look to me, my options are limited to the behavioral level, right? There's not that much choice. But let's say that this glass elevator moves to the first floor, right? Now, I still have the options of behaving differently and avoiding and controlling and intervening and all that sort of stuff. But it still looks like I'm just perceiving the world as it is. But I suddenly perhaps realized that, I can change my focus. So a lot of self-improvement programs are about, changing your focus, and what you focus on, you get more of. So as an analogy, let's say that there's a party going on in one corner of the room. Some people are having a lot of fun and dancing, and in another corner of the room, people are yelling and arguing and quarreling. So I can now choose where I focus my camera. And by focusing on some things and not other things, I can change my experience. This is a massive increase in choice, because suddenly the ability to focus my attention on different aspects of something is another additional, call it, tool. My choices are no longer just restricted to the behavioral level. I have choices in what I focus on as well. But it's still from the position of a naive realist who just responds to objective reality. Now, of course, if I operate here and I think that I pretty much see reality as it is, and you disagree with me, then I'm gonna automatically attribute to you motives and characteristics such as, just in the best of cases, misinformed. If I could just sit you down and explain things to you, you would get it. Or stupid, or crazy, or evil. Because if I see things as they are and just respond to it and you don't, that's just some limitation in you. I can't really take that much responsibility for that, because if I'm subject to completely my own psychological internal world, I don't have much choice about it, right? But let's say that this elevator moves up to the second floor. I still have these behavioral choices. I have choices of how I can, focus my camera. But now I might suddenly begin to realize more that, hey, wait a minute. I can focus on the same thing, but I can have very different experiences because I interpret experience. I kind of construct experience. So, you may have two people who have just both flunked their exams, and one person's really depressed, and the other person's kind of, in a fiery, frustrated, motivated mode. They both flunked the exam, they're both focusing on it, but one person may be interpreting it as, that's what I always suspected. I'm not smart enough, and this test just shows that. So now they're in a hopeless, depressed state. While the other person goes, I've been partying too much, and it's kind of what I suspected. This shows me that I need to study more and study harder and get my sleep in and stuff like that. So they're kind of have given themselves a kick in the ass, so to speak, and they're moving forward and getting things in order. Or for me, for example, let's say that you train with someone, sparring partners, or you coach a fighter, when you tell one fighter, you're getting hit with the left hook, keep your right glove up. And one person might get irritated and say, I haven't eaten today, and my blood sugar's low. And the other person might be grateful, because the first person's thinking, oh, he's badgering me, and the other one's interpreting it as he's trying to help me. So they can have two very different experiences. So once a person starts to kind of realize that they're interpreting stuff, you know, now it no longer looks as if their emotions are triggered or happening to them. They start to get the sense that, I'm kind of creating them by the way I interpret and make meaning. This is a huge, huge, huge change, right? It gives a lot more choice, but it still looks as if it still looks it still looks as if we see the same thing, we just interpret it differently, right? But let's say that this elevator moves up another floor. Now the whole notion of we see the same thing but we interpret it differently may begin to crumble. You suddenly may begin to realize that, holy shit, we actually see different things. So I'll give an example of this. I sometimes with clients ask them to think of a person they really like and then think of a person they really dislike, and I have them get into it, right? And one person who was very left-leaning politically slammed his fist on the chair and say, I hate, a woman called Siv Jensen, who's a progressive, who's kind of like a conservative politician, here in Norway. And he was really, really intense about that. And I kind of tried to get him to see that what he's experiencing is kind of created by his own mind. He really took exception to this because he said, no, I have these feelings because she's a hateful person, and because she's like that, I feel like this. And I said to him, look, dude, it really seems that way. But if you were to take 100 people and ask them what they feel about Siv Jensen, you get very different responses. You get some people who might say, I'd like to marry her tomorrow. She's the ideal woman. And other people might say, I want to shoot her on the spot. And other people might be neutral. And he kind of got that. And I said, but the trick is, none of these internal experiences come from the other person. None of them are the other person. They're stories that you're creating in your own mind, projecting them onto a person, right? So now you might suddenly begin to see that we don't see the same things differently. We actually see different things. I'll tell you a humorous story about this. Many years ago, my wife and I and our then baby daughter was on a plane trip to visit some family. And my wife has been in a car accident, and when she's tired, her the way she walks can look a little bit irregular, right? And she took her seat, she fell asleep immediately. It was an uneventful flight. And then once she and our daughter had left the plane, I was still packaging down some stuff, and this guy who works, on the airplane came up to me and he said, Mr. Rasmussen, I said, yes. If it had been only you and your wife, we wouldn't have said anything. But given that there's a child involved, we feel that we have to kind of, take action. And I was like, what? I had no clue what he was talking about. And he looked at me and he said, you know what I'm referring to. I looked at him. I said, I don't. I have no clue. You'll have to fill me in. And she said, Scandinavian Airlines. It's unacceptable for people to use drugs or to be on drugs, with young kids. I was like, what? And I said to him, look, I have no idea what you think you've seen, but my wife, she's a vegetarian. She doesn't use drugs. She doesn't smoke. She hardly ever drinks. She exercises every day. She's more of a health freak than anything. And he just kind of looked at me knowingly and said, I'm an expert on this matter. I know what I saw. And I said, why don't you come out and speak to her? So why don't you come out and speak to her, and you'll be able to see. No, he knew exactly what he saw. And at this point, I burst out laughing. I thought it was hysterically funny. And he got more and more angry. At the end, he actually hit the seat and he left with anger. Now, when I left the flight and told this story to my wife, she first got really, really insulted. And later on, she saw the sense of humor in it. Other people got angry on our behalf. I thought it was hysterically funny. Now, what most likely happened here was that, you know, he probably looked at her, at the way she walked. Maybe he's been on some recent course, immediately made up the story about drugs. Because I asked him, how did you make sense of this? And she said, well, she had this little limp and then she fell asleep immediately, and that means drugs. Now, of course, he doesn't know that my wife has been in a serious car accident and has some injuries from that. So he automatically concluded drugs. So when he looked at me, he saw an extremely irresponsible parent who had a partner who was on drugs, who had a little child, and was probably raging, right? And tried to be polite and tried to approach me, and I was laughing. You can imagine that when I said that I had no idea what he was talking about, that he interpreted that as denial, as no wonder he got angry. Whereas I viewed this as someone who instantaneously believed something and then fell for it hook, line, and sinker. You know, but this is not an example of two people seeing the same thing differently. We saw completely different stories that had virtually nothing to do with each other whatsoever, right? Now, if you take the elevator up, even a bit further, you might begin to get more of a systemic view of how factors of geography and history and context and all sorts of factors go into this creation of what you're seeing. So this notion of kind of being the creator of your own experience begins to loosen. And you may begin to take as object the very self or selfing process or meaning making that seems to make up your experience. And you may start to look at, what is the I or the nature of the self that seems to be making these decisions, right? Now, of course, this is just a model, but the point being here that your clients, when you see them, will be operating from very different developmental stages. So, for example, in some lines of work, taking responsibility might mean to show up on time and to be a loyal team player and to act in accordance with company guidelines and but if you get a promotion, then being responsible might mean that you have to take a step back and kind of author your own role and decide for yourself with using your own internal authority how things are supposed to be done. What's right. That's a very different way of taking personal responsibility. So for some clients who operate from very early stages of development, taking more responsibility might mean moving them towards socialization, so to speak, to take other people more into account, to internalize society in a sense, so that society becomes more a part of them and they become more a part of society, so that they can be a part of something. For other people, taking more responsibility might mean taking a step back from the socialization process and having more of your own voice and kind of owning up to being the creator of your own experience. And for some other clients, taking more responsibility might be about beginning to see that conflict is not just external, but it's also internal. To be able to begin to look at the internal authority and the system that you make meaning through, and to begin to kind of refine that and see it as made up. So development is largely about constructing a seemingly stable, permanent sense of self, and then gradually deconstructing it and see it for the illusion that it is. So you should have some sort of map for being able to make some distinctions around that in client work. So I will, on this YouTube channel, shortly begin to post some videos about how the self develops from a more adult developmental psychology perspective, and how I kind of utilize these perspectives in my change work sessions. So I hope you found this useful, stimulating. If this resonates and you want to do some mentoring or some change work, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. Till next time.